Okay, so welcome everybody. This is Conflict Consortium. Erica was my last co-host for some events, so it's very prescient that she's here as well. So we have many things going on right now in the United States, and we also have a window to discuss them. And so in this space, I thought it would be useful to convene some folks to kind of talk about what's going on. David Armstrong, myself, and Thomas Zaitsev had a piece where we talked about people's perceptions of lethality with regards to different tactics that were taken. And if you look at this, research, we see some racial differences. African Americans are more willing to see various forms of protest activities as being less lethal, whereas whites were willing to do the same kind of dynamic with regards to the police. They're ready to give them a little bit more latitude. And if you overlay these two and think of proportional and disproportionate responses, you realize we are very much living in a different world in many respects with regards to what people are willing to allow certain actors to get away with in protested events. And so what's interesting about the current moment, juxtaposed against kind of like Rodney King for a moment, where folks are unified with the fact that they see that there's some disproportionate violence that was directed against an individual in civil society, and we are uniform in this point. Now, those of us that remember the Rodney King video, many saw it and we were kind of like, that brother's getting jacked up. What's wrong with the situation? And many African Americans, I think, shared this position, and some whites. But by the time we get to the trial and you have the dissection of the video, you literally see this bifurcation of opinion where some white folks are going, well, that brother was threatening them. And some black folks are going, this brother's getting jacked up. This difference does not seem to exist at the moment. We are unified in our perception that, okay, this was just way too much. Now, this creates a window within which we could talk about things, because soon this window is unfortunately going to pass. So different people are convening different meetings around the time, which I think is great. There's something later on going on today with Hakeem Jefferson that's going to talk about race in the criminal justice system. But I specifically wanted to convene this group because we have protests and we have protesters. We have police, we have policing, both at the individual level and at the collective level. And we have protest policing dynamics. And so a bunch of people are talking in the media and they don't know anything about these topics. You all are incredibly adept at understanding this topic. So I wanted to grab some folks that were speaking to this. So Kanisha Bond does some stuff on, I'm like, talk about prescient, some stuff on Antifa, some stuff on Black Lives Matter. Jennifer Earl does a tremendous amount of work on repression, but also protest and protest policing. Dave Klinger does work on police violence and police tactics. Shea Streeter does things on racial differentials with regards to protests, specifically about police violence. Erica Chenoweth deals with dynamics concerning nonviolent direct action, but also has done work on police violence and state violence activity. And so this is the group that I thought was incredibly useful to convene. Now, so what I'd like to try to do is start us off is like, what are you seeing? And so I noticed that we all kind of gravitate to, we're focusing on slightly different things as a function of what we've been studying for the last couple of decades of our lives. And so I think we're seeing slightly different things, although I think they're overlapping. But in a sense, I don't really particularly have an order to this, but I kind of want to start with Kanisha in the sense that the Black Lives Matter connection and interest seems to be kind of present but not present. And so I kind of wanted to start with you about what you're seeing and then kind of move to Shea and Erica.
Okay, cool. Can you hear me okay? Okay, what am I seeing? So maybe I should start with noting that I'm in DC. So I live in Washington, DC. So a lot of what I'm seeing right now is sort of very much colored by the fact that I'm in this particular geographic space, also cultural space, right? But I think in general, right, sort of what I'm watching is an uprising, right? What I'm watching is an uprising that's not actually unlike the uprisings that we had sort of in Baltimore previously, in Ferguson previously, in DC or other places around the country previously. You mentioned Rodney King. I don't really know that what we're seeing is that much different sort of in content, sort of in context, of course, it's very different. So, you know, like the nature of the participants, or maybe let me say like the tenor of the mobilization is unique in that it is, like you say, sort of multi-organizational, but there is a continuity that certainly exists among most of the sort of institutionalized actors that you see, right? So where you see Black Lives Matter showing up, where you see the movement for Black Lives showing up, where you see folks from Standing Up for Racial Justice showing up, they are all fairly united, I think. Answer Coalition, you see them fairly united, I think, in the message that they're putting out. But there are a whole lot of quote unquote unaffiliated individuals that I also think, for the most part, are fairly coherent and cohesive in the message that's getting put forth, right? I think the uprising is against not the police. I don't know that the uprising is necessarily sort of directly about Minnesota or about George Floyd, even though sort of his death, his killing, his assassination is certainly sort of a tremendous catalyst. Feels to me like an uprising against sort of the content of American democracy right now, which again, doesn't really feel that much different from what I experienced anyway, what I observed all the way back to 2013, right? Because I also think it's like kind of important to note that sort of we're talking about police brutality and police killings and police overreach and sort of the overreach of the state, but you know, a lot of the people who are finding themselves in this sort of like deja vu type space remember this kicking off at the sort of tail end of a vigilante attack, right? George Zimmerman attacking Trayvon Martin in 2013, right? That's the catalyst for Black Lives Matter as an organization, right? That sort of concept of policing as a community thing and not just a state thing, I think is pretty clear in what people are saying.
Actually, Shea, before I hit you, I really want to mix it up and I want to get Dave in.
Sure. I mean, I come at this from a bunch of different angles, but the one that I've been working on most recently, I had a piece in the Annals that talks about the notion of normal accidents in police violence. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds. Basically what it does is it says that if we really want to understand how things go wrong in police-citizen interactions where high levels of violence occur, we need to look at the systems in which these things are embedded, and not in the systems in the traditional way that we might think about it, but rather in the system of policing. So for example, I'm looking at this video, and there's a bunch of things, the initial video of Mr. Floyd's death, and beyond just the gut wrench that's going on as a former police officer watching this saying, wait a second, we knew 3.5 decades ago you don't do this. And doing this is you don't put someone on their face and keep them pinned down. You just don't. We can talk about where that came from if we want to later. But anyway, I'm looking at that, and I'm also noticing that the interaction is happening on the street side of this police vehicle. Why in the world are they on the street side where it's dangerous? So on and so forth. And so then the question that hops in my mind is, why are these four officers thinking this is okay? Is this something that they were not trained about? The Minneapolis Police Department have policies? Are they acting in accordance with their training? So on and so forth. And so this notion of looking at the system started a decade ago, and then in 2010, Jim Boyle, who wrote a piece in the Journal of Technology, talking about other things that focusing on wrongful convictions and looking at how it is that a wrongful conviction occurs. Is it merely because you've got someone who wishes for the wrong person to go to prison? Is it merely because you have jailhouse informants, so on and so forth? And he sets this tenor about figuring out how the system broke down that led to the event. And so Larry Sherman picked this up in a piece in 2018, talking about the system approach, and then we were moving from there. And so as I think about this, I'm focusing on the event that led to which was the spark that lit the current fire, and how that happened. And it's very simple to say, okay, you have a racist cop, he's got 18 complaints, so on and so forth. That, for me, is a very narrow way of looking at things that misses the opportunity to understand the social context in which this event is embedded from the policing practice side. How do we, assuming for a moment that the police serve a legitimate function in society. How do we get to the point where stuff like this simply can't happen, so that everybody in law enforcement looks at it the same way I did, which is, this is wrong, this can't happen. And that can be something that we could aim for, that I think is realistic in terms of figuring out how this event happened. And we can talk more about this notion, but I think looking at it from a systems failure point of view can give us much more insight than saying, oh, this cop and these cops were bad actors and we need to punish them. That's a separate question. The criminal justice issue is a separate issue from the systems issue. And I'll stop there.
Shea.
Well, I don't know where to start. I guess I'll start off by saying, like, none of anything that we have seen so far has surprised me. I knew this was coming for a while. I examine all of these police killings deeply. I go through all the details of them for the last couple of years, and I've seen so many George Floyd cases that just don't have video, and there are so many, and the communities know about these cases. The communities regularly protest these cases. I mean, my data said, like, I found, like, a third of the police killings of Black men lead to some form of local protest, and so the capacity for organizing in these local communities has been built up for a long time. Like this, there have been years of this. I mean, pre-Ferguson, pre-George Zimmerman, this was always an issue that people were protesting in these communities. And then I think the capacity expanded, after, once, Black Lives Matter kind of took off as like an organizing kind of slogan, and also as an organization itself. And I think something that's really worth highlighting is what the role of the pandemic has played in this, because I think that it has made everyone is paying attention, because there's nothing else going on, and everyone can actually, there's a lot of constraints of, like, work and on your time that people haven't, that have constrained people from mobilizing before, that are not present right now. But also the fact that these a lot of the local organizations have filled in where the state has been lacking in everything pandemic related to food security, related to dealing with the health in the community. Everyone is tapped into these networks right now at a local level, and so dealing with the COVID outbreaks in jails and prisons, they've been really mobilized on these issues. And so they've been ready to go. And so I think that's why some people were surprised by how diffuse this was, how many cities and towns these protests have spread to. But to me, it was not surprising at all, because they already were there, they already existed, and they were already engaged with the community because of the pandemic. In terms of what the police are doing in terms of the protest policing, again, not surprised at all. I don't know what else to say about that, other than, like, it's just surprising to me how little has been learned. But I think that more than anything, I think we need to really, like, take seriously the fact that, in some cases, a lot of these protests, especially specifically in Minneapolis, they are about the police, and yet the police are the ones who are sent in to decide basically when these protests are how they're going to continue, when they're going to end, how they're going to do all these things. But it's directed at them, at their institution, and the fact that we're giving them that responsibility. I mean, if you think about, like, the Ahmaud Arbery case, like, if it was up to, if we imagine a situation where, the family and friends who were protesting for charges to be brought against them, if it was then the family, like the friends and, like, associates of the people who murdered Ahmaud Arbery, who were in charge of basically deciding, like, being, first of all, just being present at that kind of event, how inflammatory that is to have those associates present, and then also that they are the ones who get then to decide who gets treated how, and how things go down. I think we really need to, like, take that seriously and figure out does this make sense? Another point I just want to put out there, I know I'm kind of on the more intense side of this, but I think something that's been coming, I think, has really risen to the surface with this is the ideas about defunding the police. There's been lots of calls in various cities saying defund the police, and media is finally starting to pay attention to this movement. And the question automatically goes to, okay, so how are we going to do this? How is this feasible?
Don't go there yet. Don't go there yet.
All I'm saying is, I think it's worth coming up with ideas so that there is a choice, that there's not just a choice of, okay, we keep the same system or we make marginal reforms. But there is an actual conversation of like, okay, what are the possibilities? Maybe we decide that they are not feasible, that they don't work, and that they don't make sense. Fine. But just coming up, now that there is an ear for this, coming up with what are all of the possibilities. And so that way there's an actual conversation.
My bad, I didn't mean to cut you off. Jen.
So thanks, Christian, for organizing this. I'm really happy that you're doing this. And it's really nice to hear all of your voices and see some of your faces, because I haven't seen some of you in person or virtually in a while. And I think there's maybe one or two folks that I haven't met before. So thanks so much, Christian. So picking up on Sheila's last point about the sort of dual role of being both the object of protest and the those charged with controlling it, a colleague, Heidi Reynolds Stenson, did a piece in 2017 that showed that in the US,
Is it just me or is she frozen?
She froze. Jen, unfortunately, you froze right before you were about to dive into your thing. So repeat that.
oh no. I didn't even get the little warning that I was freezing. So I was saying, colleague Heidi Reynolds Stenson did a piece in 2017 where she showed in the United States that police do behave more aggressively when they're policing protests that are about police brutality versus other kinds of claims. And I think we've gone from sort of that at like a starting level to where we're at to really something that's looking much more like a 1960s or 70s.
Clearly mid-sentence, 1960s or 1970s type event, I think is where she's going, but with Jen, you kind of have to wait for that. So we'll try to give a few seconds for the pause to unpause. Damn.
I don't know why it's so bad this morning. It's been fine. If it continues like this, I'll turn off my camera.
Okay.
And then probably the audio feed will be fine.
But you said starts to look like 1960s.
Police riot. 1960s and 70s police riot. So I've studied NYPD policing of protest for a long time, and watching the videos of NYPD officers driving into crowds when you can see that they have room to back up and move around. They were not surrounded in those vehicles. If you saw any of the crosswalk videos last night where two line officers, and when you're watching an NYPD video, you always have to remember that when you see someone in white, that's a supervisory officer, they're sergeant or above. So you're seeing two line officers and a supervisory officer beat someone as they walk across a crosswalk just going home, ostensibly motivated by a curfew violation. We are really, as much focus, I've done a lot of press interviews in the last couple days and still some today about curfews and the role of curfews and curbing protester violence. But what we also need to be really looking at is there's the tremendous amount of police violence that exists that prompted these protests. There's a tremendous amount of police violence that happens in protest situations. And now there is a tremendous amount of police violence taking off around the country in a way that looks like a 1960s, 1970s police riot. And so I think that we need to really be trying to focus people's attention that as much as there's conversation in media about what about looting, what about property damage, what about protester violence, the scenes that we're seeing from police officer action right now are so far past egregious that it's really hard to fathom. I mean, as Shea said, it's not hard to fathom in some ways, but it is also hard to fathom that it's just happening. It's happening across cities. And a point that I've been making about curfews is, I think part of one of the reasons why places are doing this is because they know they can't control their line officers. And if you can't control your officers, the best thing you can do to reduce coverage of people being able to see what they're doing is give them less access to people to be aggressive, violent towards, and then make it difficult for the media to cover them. And we're seeing that happen. So the other point that I wanted to raise, besides the sort of police riot part, which I'd happily dive into more if other people want to talk about that, is sort of building on the point that was made earlier about this in the pandemic situation. We kind of are juggling three really hard things for any democracy to juggle, and we're juggling them at the same time. The situation that we've all been talking about so far, a pandemic, and also a president who has used authoritarian rhetoric in the past, but now is floating ideas that take that authoritarian rhetoric from rhetoric into action. So when you want to take over the DC police, when you want to send military out to handle everyday protest, that is a really significant shift in where we are as a country democratically. Like, as someone who studies repression across a range of countries, you know, I think 10 years ago, you could have said the United States is a democracy. It has lots of flaws. It's a flawed democracy. There's real problems with voting. There's real problems with electoral competitiveness, et cetera. But I don't think that you would edge the United States as close to China, for instance, as you could start to think about edging the United States now. I mean, just by example, in Hong Kong, even in Hong Kong pre-pandemic, Hong Kong was really reticent about using curfews. Every time a rumor went out about curfews, the government said, no, we're not doing curfews. So when all of a sudden you have just across the nation, tons of places that unproblematically do something that even Hong Kong and the mainstream Chinese government were reticent to do, that's a really serious thing to pay attention to, because if we were to believe Tom Cotton's call in his op-ed in the New York Times that we should send the military in, we have a very different nation than we did before that happened. And those three balls are not separate. They are all related to each other. These arrests, these mass arrests, are going to produce COVID cases. People are talking about the protests as if they're going to be the primary spreading. You arrest 300, 500, 800 people in a day, you cannot process those people without putting them in close proximity to each other, and you will have spreading that results from that. And so I think part of this conversation is, how do all three of these things relate and make each of them more difficult to deal with?
Damn. Okay. Glad we're here already. Everybody's dropping exactly where I thought they would go. This is so useful. Erica.
Okay, well, let me add my thanks to you, Christian, for organizing this event. And it is very good to see you and to be with you all. right now. I agree with everything that everybody has said and want to add just a couple of more thoughts about what I see in terms of the mobilization. So the first thing is that as far as I can tell with the data that Jeremy Pressman and I have been collecting through the crowd counting consortium, this is kind of fixing to be the biggest uprising we've had under Trump, which is actually a very significant thing to say because probably 7 or 8 of the 10 largest mobilizations in US history have happened since Trump was elected. And this is even gonna potentially be bigger than that in terms of the number of communities that are involved and the number of activities in smaller towns, but also potentially even the number of people who are continually mobilizing during this uprising. And that matters for lots of reasons. One of the reasons it matters is because of the show of defiance that is underway right now shows what people like Doug McAdam would call a level of cognitive liberation, which is to say, we have decided we're not going back to the way it was before we have all decided collectively to take action together. And that is actually really difficult to shut down, right? So protest policing can be what it is and everything, but people don't forget that their agency and their collective action has effects, even if those effects are, as people have said, bringing people together and building capacity for longer term struggle, which is exactly what has happened over the past 10 years with these movements. It's sort of like if people have gotten together, mobilized for a time, built organizations, felt really they got to a point where they were so burned out and felt like all of that was for nothing. But then you look at where we are today and you see exactly that it wasn't for nothing, because look at what could be organized and basically built upon to lead to the moment that we're in. So there's that piece. There's also the piece of the familiar dynamic of backfire, which is the fact that the initial brutalities that have taken place over the past few months that have been, kind of widely reported in different communities, and then these that have gotten mass consumption because of the video, that backfired, right? So that was violence that produced mobilization, and then the protest policing has produced even more mobilization. So it's not the case that all of a sudden people came out in the streets and then the police started arresting people and shooting people with rubber bullets and a bunch of people went home. The arresting people and shooting people with rubber bullets and the calls to mobilize the military brought so many more people out and said no more, so that is actually a really significant mobilization mechanism, I think, because it compounds the grievances. It compounds the audiences who feel like they have a stake in the outcome. Like Jen said, it intersects with many people's concerns about the creeping authoritarianism. There are people mobilized now who are really here for the movement for Black lives and are also really here for trying to protect American democratic institutions. Jim Mattis's letter intersected those things last night. I thought that the release of that letter at this time was actually shocking and very striking because it shows a really high level defection from an establishment kind of highly respected military figure who served for Trump and was loyal, even though he wasn't in agreement with a lot of things. And so, the reason why mass mobilization and this concerted show of collective defiance is so important is because it produces defections. And defections are the main mechanism through which these movements end up getting leverage and getting the disruptive kind of political power to force through different changes. And so for me, the question now is how uneven, because we're in this totally complex environment. We have the federal system, we have state, local kind of policing, we have all kinds of different variation even within departments, they're there's no doubt that this conversation is leading to serious kind of soul searching within certain police officers who don't know whether they can continue to be cops right now. Like that is happening. And it's also happening that it's emboldening others who are going to double down and like insist on, you know, the blue line. I mean, but those things are all happening, and they're not happening publicly. They're happening privately. And so we can't know yet, like the degree to which these types of demands that the Movement for Black Lives is making, and others are now making, will be kind of taken seriously and implemented, or will be kind of, as Shea said, part of the broader conversation. And we don't know how long this momentum can last. But I would say that last night, it was clear to me that the momentum was entirely on the side of the movement. And the reason for that is because you have these defections, but you also have Trump threatening to actually bring in the military and overtake like gubernatorial authorities, and people turned out and de-escalated the situation themselves. You know, it wasn't like all of a sudden everybody was like, oh, let's take a deep breath and not, you know, beat up and round up a bunch of protesters. It's that people came out in even larger numbers yesterday and then sort of said, we're not going to give anybody any reasons. We're standing here. We have a right to be here. You have to listen to us this time. And, you know, there's something really important that happens when a society decides they're going to solve their problems without the president. And that's what's happening. They're like, you're irrelevant right now in the sense that like, you're not part of our solution. Our communities are going to decide our future without you. And, you know, it was to me really striking that Mattis's letter said, we can unite without him. Like those were his exact words, that we can unite without. I think that's like really amazing. And I'm not trying to like center Jim Mattis here, but I just found the incredible amount of Black-led, Black protest that is happening right now to have completely transformed the nature of our country and the conversations that are now possible in this country in ways that nobody could have predicted 2 weeks ago. So I want to say on a hopeful note, I think the movement is winning major concessions, major political breakthroughs. And so the question is, are we all going to just keep pushing in the same direction, no matter what the response is? And if that happens, then I think there are major things that are possible.
Yo, I love all of y'all. This is phenomenal. So Erica, very well stated. So I'd like to gather a little bit, but also my bit was, I don't know about how you all been living through the COVID period and then the protests, but part of my sanity is music. And I guess I've been channeling PE a little bit too much with the line, you're quite hostile. And then it's like, I got the right to be hostile, man. My people being persecuted. And so there's this rage element, but part of it is this eternal return, right? So it's just like Ferguson, Rodney King, Amadou Diallo. I'm from New York. And so I'm all too familiar, and I think many African Americans feel the same way with regards to some anti-Black violence directed from the police. So I meet Dave, my first job coming out of the University of Houston, and like, you know, he was a police officer in LA. And so he's interacted with the other side, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to have him here. But it was the biggest juxtaposition to have the two of us speaking, because no one would ever anticipate that we would be speaking about the matter. In fact, we were going to do something called Violence in Black and White in order to kind of communicate this juxtaposition in many respects, because we were all evidence-based. We were all like, let's get down to the facts of this particular incident, and got away from some of the other stuff. But some of the other stuff, you just can't step away from it, right? And so I wanted to acknowledge that. I'll probably end on the positivity of Erica's last statement, but part of it is this whole issue of Black folk aren't surprised, Black folk aren't at all kind of like, well, we're like, well, oh, you're finally with us? Oh, you finally see what's going on? Oh, all this complaining I've been all this complaining I've been doing, you're willing to tolerate now? It's just like, so, which makes you wonder kind of like, all right, historically, when these things have happened, you've had a version of the Black Panther Party, the Nation of Islam, Republic of New Africa emerge as one response. The other response is kind of I'm not giving you a ballot or bullet moment, but that's one response that emerges out of this. The other response is a new civil rights movement of sorts, right? So I'm either expecting the new Black Panther Party because the last one didn't work out too well, but you kind of wondering where the brothers with the weapons, because that's one potential response. The other potential response is Black folk lead this thing that morphs into a movement of movements to not only highlight this issue, because this issue is caught up with so many others, but it gets a broader conversation started. And so that I find to be interesting. At the same time, it's just like you write things and you don't know if people read it, and you don't know kind of like what's up with it. But my Democratic Peace book was really about not just what effective repression, but under what circumstances it would deem to be legitimate that would completely undermine most of our arguments and its threat. And so the pandemic as threat justified a bunch of civil liberties restrictions and hostile and aggressive responses. The behavioral challenges themselves also kind of provide that. What's interesting though is that calibration that we're all kind of talking about. Since the police are overstepping what people believe to be an acceptable and justifiable response to what is taking place, since the police are overstepping that bound, folks are like, yo, what is this? And it's the what is this dynamic that needs to continue, because this is the problem for me, right? And this gets to Bing Powell's elections as instruments of democracy. We're expecting that folks are going to be like, okay, that's not acceptable. We're not going to tolerate this. And at the next moment of our political participation institutionalized, the vote, we're going to remember this moment. We don't remember this moment because there's so many other moments that are going on simultaneously. So how do you sustain that awareness? How do you expand the conversation, right? So we're talking about police defunding. Okay, I notice there's no police abolition, right? Because we're all realists and stuff, but I'm just kind of like, let's get to the broader conversation and institutionalize these conversations. And if we're bringing all these criticisms together, right, which is like, we got walking while Black, running while Black, driving while Black, protesting while Black, racism. Okay, let's put all that together. And then we have all these things that are happening to poor people, which we're also kind of not really addressing. I don't like the partial nature of the stuff, right? It's like, where are mutual aid organizations and all this? People just showing up for other people because there's a problem with folks just being left on the edge and marginalized in so many ways in this society and in this economy. There's a moment maybe we could tie all these things together that I think would be incredibly useful. And now we got a bunch of stuff on the table. We got biographic availability, a bunch of people just sitting around ready to get loose. We have diffusion of tactics. We have narrative control. We have how are you going to fix this problem? Defunding, abolition, training. You've stopped the violence. Like which violence? The police violence, the looters, which is hilarious, right? If you look at the Lemberg data, he's got like 4,000 instances of uprisings in America. And between 68 and 72, 6% of the cases involve looting. So sideshow to the main event, that is the violence that got us in the first place. We got rubber bullets and curfews as tactics. We have kind of riots and disorganization as a tactic. What's fascinating about the current context is like we get to these broader conversations about, well, who's leading these people? What's going on? Where's the organizational thing? And the mayor of Atlanta was hilarious. I thought, he's like, if you'd like to be politically active, then you should vote. And I'm like, what the hell is she talking about? There's so many other ways to participate within a democracy. And all of those need to come together as well. And I think they're getting highlighted. But we have a bunch of stuff on the table. This group is not going to have a problem. So everyone just kind of like jump in accordingly. Kanisha, I see you sent a message, so shoot.
Yeah, this is so awesome. So I just want to, sorry, like I started with some context, right, that I'm in DC. Like I'm also sort of living this as a Black person, and particularly as a Black woman. And I just want to acknowledge, like I should have done this off the break, but I'm pissed off. I am disgusted. I am tired because this is not new, as everyone has discussed, right? So there is like, we're talking about all these dynamics, right? And so we're kind of getting at, I think, sort of where sort of the role of Black leadership is, or Black mobilization, Black community mobilization in this. This is not just about racism. This is about anti-Black racism. Like, we're not talking about just sort of any person of color, quote unquote. We're not just talking about any community of color here. This is a particular community in a particular country in a particular context, and we know what that is, right? These are people who have been historically at the bottom of the racial hierarchy on which this country was founded. Some of this is not a bug, right, that this happens. And I think there are quite a few people who recognize that. And so there's, right, the folks that have been recognized this, and then there's the folks that are maybe newly recognizing this. There's like a consciousness shift that's happening, right? And there are, I think, sort of some of the heterogeneity in who we see in these sort of, like the crowds that we see, and sort of the voices that we're hearing is reflecting the different stages that people are at and actually recognizing sort of what exactly the system is and what it was intended to do, and how not anomalous any of these events actually are, even as upsetting as they might be to us. So, you know, when we talk about whether or not the movement for Black lives or just sort of Black people, Black Americans, concerns ought to be taken seriously, I feel like they better be taken seriously. They better be leading, because that's what this is about, right? Right now, the thing that people were paying attention to is watching a Black man be killed in the street. That can't be, I don't want to all lives matter it away, right? In the attempt to sort of generalize and to sort of put this in a broader context. And I think that is, for me, so yeah, so you kind of like build me a studying like Black Lives Matter and also Antifa at the same time. I do, they're sort of movements in dialogue with each other. Part of the dialogue that they're having with each other is who's gonna lead and what does it mean to lead, right? And what do you need out front? And who's gonna be willing to sacrifice? So maybe I'm sort of pulling from what everybody's saying here because it's all fascinating and so my mind is going a million miles a minute, but I think when we think about the role of the pandemic, I think it's absolutely true that we've all been in the house for 6 to 8 weeks, right? With varying degrees of fear and vulnerability, and then also experience. That's sort of conditioning the way that we take in what is presented to us, because as Shea pointed out, not every single instance of this makes its way to our screens or to our everyday lives. But I think one thing, I've been thinking about this for a while, I think one thing the pandemic may have been doing is redistributing risk in a really curious way. So anybody can get it from coronavirus, really, right? Like, it is not sort of distinguishing the virus itself amongst individuals politically the way that we do, but we see the effects of the virus being reflective of the way that we do that sorting on political lines, and particularly on racial lines, right? It's just not lost. I mean, my heart's broken to watch George Floyd's family mourn at the site of his death, and to see the crowds and to see the people lifting him up and holding him up, and to think of the thousands of people that couldn't have that opportunity because they were alone in their house or they were alone in a hospital and they were suffering from this virus. It's extremely contagious, and the majority of those people are also Black and brown. Like, there's really something to be said, I think, for the way that risk has accumulated over time for the people who are at the center of the problem, and the way that it seems like it's starting to diffuse to others who maybe might not have seen themselves in such a vulnerable position.
Shea?
So I think, thank you, Kanisha. I mean, everything that you said, like 100, I want to amplify like 1,000%. Something that, because I know, I'm sure a lot of, you know, you've been getting questions in the media, or just all this talk about the, you know, looting or, you know, property damage. And I think it's just really worth just acknowledging how remarkably controlled it has been. Like, you know, we had some stuff at the beginning, but it did not last very long. And even beyond that, I mean, really recognizing that this was I mean, there may have been a few exceptions, but for the most part, very deliberately targeted. I mean, we're not seeing, you know, a replay of, like, you know, granted, I know I was not really, I do not remember the LA riots, but my, reading things of like, you had, communities being really, burned down and destroyed, where places where people were actually living and working and occupying. Here we're seeing like corporate targets. We're seeing police targets. We're seeing like there's a real link between like, this is about the police and this is about capitalism in a way that a lot of these targets have been deliberately chosen. You see some things that kind of go off the rails, but for the most part, this has been like quite, much more controlled and much more targeted than it would be otherwise. And the fact that it's already really died down, I think, is quite remarkable. And I think, there's been, the fact that the learning has happened so fast, I think is pretty remarkable. But I think that's something that's getting lost a lot. And granted, I think that, I've been studying, especially with regards to how the police, I know the rest of you have as well, but looking at the incidents of following police killings, when they, when do the police use tear gas? When do we see any kind of property damage? It's really rare. But even in those situations, like when I actually map out the sequence of events, almost without fail, it is tear gas or it is some other aggressive policing tactic that precedes the property damage. Like, I mean, I was there for many nights in St. Louis in 2017 when the Stockley works were going down, and just seeing time and again how like everyone was like, people were waiting for that explicit permission of like, the police have to start this off. Like, we're not going to be the ones to start off to start off this or any kind of damage. And just really questioning like the role of the police in terms of manufacturing often this property damage. It's hard to, I think there have been in this incident a little bit of break from that in a few situations, because you have people who kind of aren't with the script. Like, there's a real clear script of like, that you see time and again in these cities, because they've had this experience back and forth with the police where both sides really know, like, this is the script, this is the dynamic, this is the dance basically we're gonna play. So you've had some new actors coming in who saw, property damage in some other cities and then, wanted to participate in that in a way that was kind of separate from usual, but that's really on the margins. But I think I just want to acknowledge that there's been so much concern, there's so much attention to this, but it's been remarkably constrained.
Can I hop in for a second?
Hit it.
Yeah, I think it is an empirical question about how these things are going to be playing out in each of the events. But I think from the social science side, we had 4 cops who were shot 2-3 nights ago overnight in St. Louis. The fire bombs that were tossed, or the firebomb that was tossed at the NYPD van, so on and so forth. And so in terms of trying to understand what's going on from the police side, you can't divorce those events from what is in the mind of officers in terms of trying to figure this out. And then also, I think, Shea, one of the points you were getting to, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there are people who are taking advantage of the moment to engage in forms of violence that are not part of the standard issue protest against what's going on. And so trying to tease out all the different elements that are afoot, people from all sorts of walks of life in all sorts of circumstances far less dramatic than this are looking to take advantage of a moment for their own ends. And I think if we remember that there are going to be people who are going to be trying to utilize this as cover for other things, and that there is an element of extreme violence that can help us get a handle on some of these issues as we move forward.
Yeah, I want to jump in. What's interesting in many respects is there's this tension, right, where some folks want to, I'll put myself in this category. Some folks want to expand the temporal parameters and just like, let's look at how inequality is developed in the country and what role that police power has played in that development. So creation, founding of the country, development of the country? What role did the police play? Who were they set out to police? Why are they policing them? How is policing differentially applied across different communities? There's that part of me. And some people are wanting to do that, but other folks are just like, I was speaking in some public policy class a couple of days ago. Someone brought me in to talk about stuff. Like, I'm like, okay. But their interests were, what can we do now? And what's realistic, what's practical? And so I'm very glad that we, that I have a profession where I don't have to give a damn about what's practical, but we should have a conversation about what is necessary and try to shift this debate, right? So it's just like, it's like all the mobilization around prison abolition. It's okay, we could talk about that now. Okay, well, we might not really get there. And from what I can gauge, a bunch of people are just kind of like, well, we don't really think they're gonna be eliminated entirely because some people need to be locked up. I have some in my family. I'm more than willing to kind of admit that. So then we're gonna be like holding back on that. But then the conversation is bracketed. And I always thought it was fascinating. It's like, okay, we talk about prison abolition, we talk about defunding the police. This conversation is not linked to, well, why don't we defund the military? Why don't we abolish the military? What role does coercion and force play within the society? And there's this fundamental knee-jerk thing we have. Well, if the police aren't there, then what's gonna happen? And it's interesting, right? It's just like, okay, you could take a Jim Scott effect. It's like, okay, we've had, for the majority of human civilization, we've not had a police and stuff's been all right. Then we have what Eric is talking about, which is just like, okay, no, people are showing up for each other right now, and the police aren't part of the conversation, nor is the political leadership. So our daily life is basically comprised of one another. So we are actually able to do this without the coercive, forceful element of the state. So we have this moment to have this conversation about what role we want coercion and force to have in our lives. And then others are just kind of like body cameras or defunding of the police. These very practical, very narrow kind of suggestions which militate against this broader conversation. And is the society ready for this broader conversation? I don't know. We've tried to have it a couple of times and we never got there. I mean, I referenced the rolling sideshow created by the Clinton administration to talk about race and racism in America. You read the transcripts from those things. It's just like John Hope Franklin, I think, was chair of the committee, and they went around to each kind. I was in Denver at the time. They went around to different communities and just like, let's talk about racism. It's like, here's what the commission is about. Here's what we're doing. Here's the mic. You have it for 30 minutes. Oh, you only have a minute to speak. And you'd have like some 70-year-old black man come up there who was finally happy that someone asked him about his experience in racism in America. And of course, he has more than a minute. And by the time you get to the end of that minute, it's like, oh, okay, thank you very much, sir. Let's move on. And he's just like, it was the most frustrating experience ever because people don't want to take the time to have that discussion. And if we don't have the time to have that discussion, we're going to have this bifurcated conversations because people are going to talk about it. They're just going to talk about it in their own communities. And other folks, I don't know if it's empathy, if it's opportunity or whatever, other folks are not necessarily open for, yeah, you know, I don't really want to hear all your problems. We've all suffered. And so my approach to it has always been like, well, let's document this suffering. And then we can have an actual comparative conversation about what's going on and what has happened. Because so folks are just like, I hate this response. It's like, well, we've all suffered. I'm just like, really? I'm like, you know, let's document that. And it's interesting, right? Because we don't have much data on every group suffering within every society over time. Minorities at risk tried to have an approach to it. That got kind of jacked up. AMAR tried to kind of respond to it. There's some temporal problems with that. There's some sampling issues with that. So, but we never got to that whole issue. But it seems like we don't really want to have that conversation. I remember reading something where just like Americans have their back to the past and they're looking towards the future. Whereas many Asian societies have their back to the future and they're looking at the past. And so there's this element with this temporal dimension, which we need to get around, because if we only have a short window to actually talk about several hundred years worth of dynamics and the role of various institutions, then we're not going to be able to come up with anything. And unfortunately, in another 10 or 15 years, we're going to be back at the same exact point with, oh, the police are at it again. Okay, what are we going to do now? Oh, we need some more Black police officers. Oh, we need some body cameras. Oh, we need some better training. The same solutions have been coming up for, for quite some time, right? And so how do we resolve that? How do we get some traction in these broader conversations? You'd like to think that, all we need to do is go below a certain level and then folks can come together and then we can intelligently address these issues. Well, How much lower do we need to get? Who's up? Y'all are some talkative people, so don't even try it. I know all of y'all. Go ahead.
So I think one way to think about that is that it probably needs to be both of those kinds of conversations, the big picture rethinking, but also the practical, because I think when you hear people who, let's say, are resistant to the idea of change, talk through this, pretending that there are not things that can be done is one way to excuse the need to do something. And so I think actually both of those conversations are really important, because we can't let there can't be a public imagination that says there is nothing that can be done is not true. There are a ton of things that can be done. There are things tomorrow. There are big picture. Did I freeze again?
Just for a second.
There are big picture things that can be done. There are those deep conversations that we could and should have. But I think it's probably got to be both, because I think there are lots of people who, for various reasons, don't want to change, and presenting that the idea that, oh, well, there's nothing practical that can be done just gives them an excuse to not do anything.
Kanisha.
I think in some ways, I 100% hear what you're saying, but I also think in some ways we can maybe be in a little bit of a rush to find like the pragmatic, right, like strategically optimal solution without doing a whole lot of recognizing sort of what the emotion and the consciousness is underneath it. And I actually think that that is a huge component of what we're experiencing right now. Right, so there must be some reliable outlet for folks to be able to discuss the hurt, the repression, the oppression, the loss, the death, the trauma that they have experienced at the hands of the organization of the American state thus far. There has to be. And if there's not, then we're just going to keep doing this in sort of microcosm, right? Somebody gets killed, we publicly mourn, we figure out how to sort of wipe our faces and pull ourselves up, and then we go on, because that's what Black folks have done since we've been in this country, right? Like, I think that, right, like to see, for example, right, to see the African Union statement, so essentially to the American public, right, sort of exhorting on, in whatever kind of way, like, I understand people want to think about the legitimacy of international organizations differently, but in any kind of way, to see sort of this organization that's intended to represent sort of the voices of African people, right? Not only as a political quantity, but also as a cultural quantity. To say, look, we see what's happening. We see you, you are us. When it happens to you, it happens to us. But here's the bracket, you all are in the United States. We're not Americans. And in some ways, I feel like that is the ultimate catch-22 for the Black American, right? Is that we're supposed to have this access, and we're supposed to have this capacity and this agency that doesn't exist by virtue for others by virtue of our citizenship, but the actual lived reality is not that. It's not that expectation. And so managing those two kind of personas, both globally and domestically, is exhausting. So, you know, when we talk about violence, like, I don't want to at all sort of cancel out the agency of Black folks who saw Black folk get killed and maybe decided to wild out, or maybe decided that they were going to liberate some resources that they couldn't otherwise have access to. But it goes both ways, right? So when you loot a target and you liberate the formula and you put it under a tent to redistribute to others, the question is, who gets it then? And sometimes it will be the folks that you want to be able to have it that can't access it, because as we've all been talking about, there are other elements that aggregate up into this like complex oppression that we're experiencing. And so I'm not sure how sort of looking for the pragmatically optimal solution gets us anywhere, but sort of chopping up the problem. Whereas to my mind, and in the way that I hear sort of the problem to be solved, articulated by many of these, let's be clear, criminalized and victimized communities that often find themselves out there on the front lines in the streets to get on CNN for us to watch and feel a way about. They're trying to figure out sort of how do we get to a place where we can articulate the fullness of Black experience, the vulnerability of Black experience, and the necessity of Black experience to America, such that we can start to think about where we can even start to make an intervention.
D.
Yeah, I come at this obviously from a different perspective in terms of the how to proceed, where to proceed. I see the issue, while there are clearly racialized aspects of this, I see it much more broadly as a problem of democracy and a problem of a polity that is very interested in freedom, but wanting order. And then you have this mechanism called the police. As Chris said, over time and space, there haven't been historically civilian police. Now we can talk about the history of military units that did domestic policing, so on and so forth. But at any rate, one of the things that has always fascinated me about police violence is the first riot that I am aware of in the wake of police use of deadly force happened in New York City in the 1850s, when a white officer is involved in some type of confrontation with some other white guy and he kills him. And there was a riot and an attempt to lynch, literally tried to kill this police officer from the community. And so when we think about the issue of police violence and we think about concerns about police violence, I think it's too limiting to look at it in terms of merely the Black experience, because that is one of the broad experience of a polity that has always had this sense of we don't want to have the government in charge of us. Not in any way, shape, or form to diminish the particular experience, but I do think we should look at it in this broader context. And that's one of the reasons why I think as we move forward, this notion of looking at the system breakdown and the system crash, to use Larry Sherman's terms, of an event where these forces join together and somehow a police officer or police officers do something that didn't have to happen, that then leads to extreme violence. And I don't have enough time, obviously I don't want to monopolize the time to lay it all out, but there's some really, really thoughtful people involved in trying to get this systems approach to police violence applicable. So one of the things that's gone on, for example, and this gets back to, I think it was Shea's point about the cops are the ones that are the object of the protest, and they are the ones who are to control the protest from the social control perspective. I think that's what Shea was talking about. Well, in Wisconsin and some other places, what has happened is they have decoupled the review of the death or the severe injury from a gunshot from the locals to a broader group who's going to come on in and investigate. And then another piece of that is trying to figure out how to have a review that doesn't look at the legal component at all and says, why did this happen? And were there things that the police could have done to prevent this? And let's just say hypothetically that we can get the cops to perform better and avoid, let's just say hypothetically, we knock it down from about 1,000 people shot to death in the United States a year, which is what the Washington Post has come up with. Let's just say we can knock that down to 500, and let's say that it's proportional across the board. We move from about 250 Blacks in the United States killed to about 125. That would be glorious. That would be wonderful. Don't know if it's realistic, but there are, from this technocratic systems perspective, there are very, very sound theoretical and then some empirical evidence from other systems, such as civil aviation, to suggest that we could probably do that. The question is, how long will it take? But anyway, so the point is there are these things going on in the background of how the police are policing, and some smart people, both in law enforcement and outside of law enforcement, that are trying to figure out the nub of this issue, which is how do we reduce the extreme violence between the police and the polity? And then shifting away, I've been focusing on the use of deadly force, i.e. pulling the trigger. Something like Mr. Floyd dying, as I indicated when I first started talking, it was mind-boggling to watch that. It literally made no sense. So how could it be that I knew not to do that 35 years ago, but it happened it happened last month. It just doesn't make sense. So we need to dissect that. We need to figure out exactly why that happened, and that can be a linchpin to moving forward. And I agree with Chris. Body cams are not the solution. Merely training officers, implicit bias, whatever. It is changing the way that police officers interact with citizens in ways that will reduce the likelihood that it will lead to violence. And if violence occurs, because we can't get rid of violence, that's just the way it is the least number of bullets fired, it is the least number of blows struck, it is the least intrusive action by the police to control somebody who needs to be controlled. Because unfortunately, there are bad people in the world who wish to do bad things. And so with all of that, I'm just suggesting that there may be some ways that if we think outside of the box that Chris laid out about the standard issue things, that maybe we can reduce the level of violence between the police and the polity. At least that is my hope.
Shay.
And then finally, I can only be on for about another 15 or 20, and then I got to skate, so thank you very much.
Okay, I have a lot. First, I want to just clarify the thing I said earlier about the property damage. I don't actually think that there are that many people that are coming in for some separate agenda. I mean, maybe you have some undercover cops, or maybe you have some right-wing people coming in or whatever. But I think for the most part, what I was talking about of not following the script are people who are new to these types of protests and don't know what's the sequence of events. That's more what I'm talking about. And I think it's very clear that they've socialized into what the norm is pretty quickly. So I think there's two things. There's several there's a Venn diagram of many different things going on that we're talking about. So one is, the Black experience in America, of which police was one aspect, and we've all talked about this, of just the overall nature of the economic, the health disparities, just all of it. That's what these protests are about, is all of it, of being the police violence being the catalyst of it. This is about Black lives in their entirety, not just about somebody being killed or not by a particular type of individual. I mean, the fact that Black Lives Matter was really originated by a civilian killing, and also, the Ahmaud Arbery, which really opened the door for the George Floyd case to get all the attention that it's gotten. You might put them in boxes. I mean, I know my research, I have to put them in boxes because I'm only looking at, police killings, but this is not about boxes. And so in terms of what we need, I mean, I think at the very minimum, in terms of the Black experience, we need some kind of truth commission. And I'm going to leave out the reconciliation part. I don't know what that's going to look like, but just people speaking their truth. Christian, you're talking about the guy, the man who only had 1 minute to tell his story, to tell his piece. We need something that is going to, at the very least, just let it be known, let everyone's truth be known. There's the policing aspect of it. And I mean, first, I do think that it would be a hard time trying to convince people right now that we'll make these reforms that only 150 Black people will be shot per year instead of 300. I don't think that's not a compromise people are willing to take at this point. No, that people, I don't think there's no going. That is, I don't think is going to be seen as an acceptable solution. But even if we were to kill 0 Black people in this country, police, there would still be at least 800 deaths. There's still like another 800 people being killed of different races and ethnicities. And this really, and I think, so I mean, this is why I really think we need to let's go, like, just from this moment, let go of feasibility, let go of realistic. Let's imagine a new world in which not only is it the crime or these things that the surface level things, but let's get to the root causes, because, you know, I look at these cases all the time, and yes, there are cases where there are the cases where the police were clearly, like, there was easily something that could have been done. And then there are cases where you're really dealing with human tragedy that is leading people to put others in danger, including the police. And so you need to deal with that human tragedy. And so instead, we need to, I think, move the conversation away from crime and punishment and even justice. Like, what is justice? Justice, you're trying to balance a scale, but really, you know, we have 2 different needs here. And so, I mean, dealing with something that moving away from crime and punishment, but more towards like public health and safety, and thinking of this in like a public health aspect. What do people need to be well? If you take care of their if we address economic needs, if we address health needs, if we address emotional and mental well-being, you know, get people the medication they need, all of these things you don't deal with, so you don't have the human tragedy that the police are being called to deal with anyways, which they're not equipped to deal with. You know, people call the police when they're having problems with their, you know, sons having behavioral problems. They call the police when, you know, they have a dispute with their neighbors. These are human issues that we need a different system to deal with. And if we deal with those root causes, I don't believe that they're bad. They're just bad people. There are people that are in sets of circumstances where their needs are not being met and they act in certain ways. And yes, some people may need to be removed from society so that we can really address their needs, but it should be an addressing needs standpoint and a public health standpoint rather than a crime and punishment.
Erica.
Yeah, so I think that the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter and many other organizations have a lot of practical ideas that they've been putting out about ending police brutality against Black people. And those are all things that we can all amplify and pursue. But they include things like, you know, what Kanisha and Shea have been saying, that call for not just, you know, defund the police, but reinvest those funds into Black communities to provide emergency relief to Black communities who have been neglected for generations of government inaction. And, you know, the call is to actually comprehensively address racism and its effects in the society, right? And so to a certain degree, I think that it is important. Christian, you were sort of saying you weren't sure about the mayor of Atlanta calling for people to vote. And I think if we're only calling people to vote, that's really problematic. But it's really important that people vote, because representation matters so much in starting to have the conversations, to have serious consideration of actually some radical ideas. I mean, you know, Barbara Lee and Deb Haaland introduced this legislation for a Truth and Reconciliation and Racial Healing and Transformation Commission, right? And this is different from the types of things that, you know, you could have under Bill Clinton, who, you know, he, you know, his commission was on race, as if race is the problem instead of racism being the problem, right? So, and that, even just that nuance is something that we will get when we have representation of these communities in power, you know, like there is something really important about that. One of the news stories that I really wish was at the front page instead of all of the drama that was unfolding with high tension in Washington, D.C. yesterday was all of the results of all the primaries around this country, where people, it turns out, people showed up in like numbers that beat 2016 in terms of primary participation. And, you know, the first Black person was elected to be the mayor of Ferguson. It happens to be a Black woman, you know, like this is some shit. And I quote, you know, like that is amazing. And it is happening at this time when people are fighting for their lives in the streets and turning up and voting. And that really matters for the types of possibilities that we can consider as a country. And so I just want to put that out there in the sense of it's all of the ways that we can engage and keep pushing the conversation forward and lifting up people who are courageous enough to put these things on the table in public for conversation, and who can continue to lead us in these ways. So I just wanted to flag that and just say, like, the thing that I think, like, I will take personal responsibility for, and I think hopefully all of us can take personal responsibility for, is to not let this moment fade without change, right? Like we can't just talk about it and have people read a bunch of books and learn about it and then go home, like that are, you know, new to the conversation or something. We take everybody into the conversation from where they're at. Like people can't be anywhere but where they're at, and we have to move it along further, and we have to keep doing that until people are in power who are willing to make these changes, and they are accountable to the communities who put them there. I mean, that to me is like how we're gonna come out of this. And I have a lot of hope about it, because I've been seeing my country over the past 10 years show up for these conversations in unimaginably hard circumstances. And I think that if we keep doing it, it's gonna happen. You know, we just have to keep doing it.
So it was interesting, right? It's just like, so as a human rights scholar, I care about human safety. As an African-American, I care about Black safety, right? And so what's really interesting is to what degree do the processes that facilitate human safety also overlap specifically with Black safety. And so I think that becomes an interesting question for me. I'd like to not have to prioritize. I'm just like, okay, well, you know, I can't get to human safety right now, but I could try to protect some Black people as I go for a jog down my block and then wonder about my safety, right? So maybe there's some degrees to which some are more at risk than others, right? This is why I like the Minorities at Risk project. I was just like, okay, you know, it might be helpful to figure out who's most at risk and then help them first, and then work back up work up the list, right? So yeah, all lives matter, that's fine, but not everybody's equally likely to have that risk. And so if we had that data, then we can make that evaluation. So that's useful. But related to that, right? Many folks, including myself, and maybe this might be the first year that I kind of shift from it, but as an African American, I've been kind of like anti-voting. I'm just like, I've been looking for the data. I'm just like, show me where my substantive condition as an African American has been fundamentally altered by what takes place within the political system. And I'm like, can we talk about inequality? Can we talk about like my life expectancy, or the life expectancy of Black people is less than that of whites, controlling for everything? Something's explaining that difference. And I'm just like, we can go across the different dynamics, and I'm just sitting there going, oh, like, well, if we're not talking about these issues, my issues don't come up, right? I'm just like, I want to talk about how the United States government allocates the funds that it basically collects, and talk about what I think that money should be spent on. And I don't see an open conversation about that. I don't want any money spent on the military. I don't want any money spent on the space program, which gets me in trouble with other people. I'm just like, you know, Gil Scott-Heron, why are you on the moon? This got nothing to do with Black people. I'm just like, Tang, I mean, like, give me the connections between what happens out there and what happens to people dying right now from what roaches excrete and all this other business. I'm like, I want to see those connections. And so I think there's a little bit of that. But partly we're to blame, right? It's just like symbolic representation gets a heck of a lot more attention than substantive representation. I'm just like, who can help improve your life chances? Should be a question that political scientists ask. But you know, I have my own students going, was like, well, is health really a political question? I mean, like, shouldn't I pay attention to how violence affects voting behavior? I'm just like, are you kidding me? I'm like, whether or not people stay alive or not as a function of what the government does is at the core of what political science is about. And so, but I think when you see what happens on courts and how some of those rulings take place, you're like, okay, maybe voting might matter. Although, invoking Will Moore, I'm kind of like, why do people with weapons listen to people without weapons? Is like a core element of some other and interesting dynamic, right? That's why I'm just like, if you keep violently treating Black people, to expect Black people to never respond violently is just ridiculous. But then KRS said this, right? If your conception of violence is allowed, but my conception of violence gets me labeled in a particular manner and then treated in a particular manner from the state, that's not right, and people are going to respond to that. And so I think these issues kind of need to arise. But I'm like, who's taken the class on capitalism lately? I'm just like, I'm trying to reread some of this stuff, Baran and Sweezy. I'm trying to go back to a bunch of these things to understand, like, okay, well, what stage of capitalism are we in? How much poverty is going to be expected, and what are we supposed to do with that level of poverty? So some countries have been like, you know what, no amount of poverty is acceptable. We're going to have a baseline and everybody's going to have that. In this country, we're kind of like, well, yeah, there's a baseline. Some people are underneath it. If they're beneath it, we'll try to do a little bit for them, but not too much because they're there because they deserve it or they're not really worthy. This rampant individualism that we see part of the culture directed towards, but there's this other element out there, right? That's Erica's voice, right? The other part out there where people are more mutual aid societies and people showing up for other people and people taking care of their neighbors. And think of how many like everyday instances of communication and love that we showed displayed by people during the last few months. That was incredible, and I think that mutual aid dynamic, that kind of showing up for other people, reflects in the context of how quickly this thing diffused. Because you had a bunch of people that were sitting around who were already kind of predisposed towards thinking of, hey, you know what? I don't think Mrs. Johnson was able to get out. Let me get some bread for her and leave that in front of her door. Or like, oh, let me get another thing of milk when I'm doing this type of thing over here. We were already there. And so maybe that helped tremendously. When we saw some abuse, we were just like, okay, let's help. Let's help these folks. And the global response is deep. I'm getting stuff from Ghana, from London, from India, where folks are just like, okay, stop treating Black people the way you are, which is then bringing me back to the 60s when folks were just like, stop treating Black people the way you are. And I'm kind of like, all right, so we have some sympathy. That's helping. But as folks said, we are in America, so we don't really give a damn what the international community thinks. But it does matter in some way, which is, I think, an extremely important dynamic. So I think there's many things that are like we're able to do, right? Address homelessness, poverty, where that comes from, how we address it, and always being attuned to racial differentials, but seeing if there's these moments where they're like, okay, you know what, if this thing is distinct to Black folk, okay, this thing is seemingly affecting everybody, and we need to kind of address them, and we need to kind of have that catalog. And I don't think we've had that conversation, in part because of the bifurcated nature of social science, right? Economists are focused on this, political scientists are focused on this, sociologists this, anthropologists that. And that isolation has not helped us come up with any grandiose or uniform kind of explanations or explorations about what's going on. Kanisha, you had something. And
I just want to make a quick point on the mutual aid collectives and networks, which are tremendous, outstanding, and like such a source of joy for me, actually. So the ability to be able to connect with my neighbors and to think through on a real sort of hyper local, like ultra local level, sort of how do we think about how best to care for each other has been tremendous. It's been a tremendous help for me. One thing that's interesting in DC though, is that at some point in the not too distant past, when you called the helpline to DC government, if you needed help getting groceries or getting your medicine or something, they would direct you to the mutual aid lines for each of the wards in DC. They were completely grassroots, developed, co-opted by the government then. So the question then for me is, how do we make sure that what we're doing for us, for the people, stays for us and of the people? Because I worry about sort of what that co-optation looks like and what that access does sort of down the line.
Folks, I'm not one for pushing anything. Okay, yes I am. But I think we have a lot of stuff on the table, which is good. I think the elements that we've highlighted are incredibly useful. I think that all of us are engaged in things in our personal lives where through our interaction with students, our family, our friends, op-eds, the research that we do, we will all be doing things that are related to this topic. I'll do my best after this thing is posted and up to highlight the things that you see are coming on, and then to kind of like reconnect every now and then with regards to grabbing information from you or seeing what's going on. I think we need to be better about coordinating our own efforts so that we can better help everybody else and serve as a resource. I think that's one of the things that we're well positioned to do. And there is going to be a bunch of dynamics with regards to narration of what's taking place and why, and connecting those narratives to these broader issues. And I think we're also well positioned to address that as well. So I wanted to thank all of you for showing up now. Showing up always. You all are amazing of heart and amazing researchers as well. And so the engaged scholars in all of us, I think, clearly manifest. I imagine things will be jacked up later and will require another session like this. And so I think the more of these we have, the better. The more we can get our stuff out to as many people as possible, the better. Because in large part, I think what we're dealing with, we have a crisis of imagination with regards to what is possible. And I think all of us are in that space to kind of think about what is possible and relate that to what is taking place and push the parameters of what is something that is able to emerge. And so thank you all for being here. The attendees, thank you for showing up. As we post things and you see it, please pass this on to other folks. Hakeem Jefferson's got something going on. I think it's 3 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. I'll try to post that as well on social media. But everybody be well, be safe, and talk to you soon.
Thanks very much for letting me participate.
Definitely.
Pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, y'all.
Appreciate you.
Good to see you all. Happy birthday, Christian.
Thank you.